everybody, it's Abby Ferry, and this is another edition of the Safety News with Abby Ferry. Today is Sunday, March 29th, and of course, COVID-19 coronavirus is still very much in the news, even over the weekend. There's actually been a couple of very interesting things that have happened over the weekend that will impact especially those that work in healthcare settings. So, as we know, respiratory protection, respirators, N95s have been super difficult to source, especially if you are not in a healthcare setting. In fact, many supply companies will not supply you with new N95s and masks unless you are in a healthcare setting. And so those in manufacturing, construction, and other industries that might usually wear respiratory protection, like N95s, you're having a tough time with getting those masks. And so the problem is that the healthcare providers don't have the supply that they need. And many doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers have been told recently to either reuse their N95s. People have basically been told this is your last N95, so take care of it. And as we know, as users of N95s, that's just not acceptable. They're a disposable piece of personal protective equipment. Healthcare providers have also been told to clean their N95s, and up until this weekend haven't really been given a lot of resources or real methods to conduct that cleaning, or any definitive answers or policy on if the cleaning methods that have been out there and been tested, if they are really that great for them to use, if they're going to be effective. So now there's some options, and just this weekend, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, issued what they call EAUs, Emergency Use Authorizations, for cleaning procedures and the use of non-NIOSH approved respiratory protection. So last week on LinkedIn, I had posted a call for information and had my question answered by somebody about, for example, there's KN95 masks that come out of China or are approved for use in China, but they are not approved as an equivalent here as a NIOSH approved piece of respiratory protection. They seem to be pretty similar. The testing seems to check out pretty close, but they're not technically NIOSH approved. And so there are those KN95s and a few other N95 equivalents that were not approved by NIOSH, but now are finding themselves on a list of okay to use by the FDA, even though they are not NIOSH approved respiratory protection. So I've got a list linked there of that emergency use authorization from the FDA on my website. Also, cleaning procedures are what the EAU addresses is a cleaning procedure that is through the use of what's called the Battelle decontamination system. Battelle is Battelle, and hopefully I'm saying that right. And that decontamination system uses vaporized hydrogen peroxide to clean N95 masks for using them again. And so this vaporized hydrogen peroxide method is something that Duke Medical School looked into recently and published a study, and a lot of these things were developing towards the end of last week on Thursday or Friday. So it was interesting to see this news play out over the weekend and ultimately culminating in this emergency use authorization. And so I had first thought that these Battelle systems were something that a healthcare facility could purchase and have it at their site, but it turns out it is a mail shipment type of procedure. So what happens is healthcare facilities, they'll collect the contaminated N95 masks and they ship them to Battelle, and Battelle is located in Ohio. And there is a chain of custody procedure that's supposed to be followed, and that's detailed in the EAU. So when you click on the EAU, there's a table, and there's several different documents that go along to support the EAU. And so they give you the information for healthcare facilities and also for healthcare providers. So they follow that chain of custody. It includes labeling, so you'd have a site code and another identification code that you actually would basically take a Sharpie and write it on the N95 mask, so it can be understood how many decontamination cycles that particular mask has gone through. So if you follow the chain of custody procedure and these masks are subjected to that vaporized hydrogen peroxide cleaning, The masks are then to be disposed after 20 decontamination cycles. So 20 times these masks could be sent back to Battelle in Ohio. So ultimately, it sounds like the chain of custody would be followed, and at Battelle they would be disposing of the respirators once they hit their 20 cycles or earlier if there are visible contamination. So if there are visible contamination, and this could include even makeup, so for healthcare providers, if they're wearing makeup, if that gets on the mask, that automatically makes it a candidate to just be thrown out. So other visible contamination would include blood or other bodily fluids that cannot be decontaminated by the Battelle process, and so they would just throw them out. So it's up to the healthcare facility to have a place where they can collect these contaminated N95s and no other PPE. So a healthcare provider can't be taking off the N95 and shoving used gloves in there and throwing it into the container. It has to be just the N95 separated, and then those get sent off to the Battelle facility. So it remains to be seen how this process is actually going to play out, how many healthcare facilities actually take advantage of it, but I'm definitely curious to hear from healthcare facilities if you do start using this Battelle system. It was a very quick process from finding out about it late last week to having this FDA approval that occurred over the weekend. So the other way of getting N95s and papers and face shields and other equipment to healthcare providers has been happening on the grassroots level. So several companies here locally that I've seen and companies throughout the country have been donating their backup supply or on-the-shelf supply of N95s especially, and also, like I said, those other types of respiratory protection and also face shields. There's a local college here in the Minneapolis area that is actually they developed and they're manufacturing shields, face shields for healthcare providers to wear as well. So pretty cool innovation that's happening. And so what's happening is that these N95 supplies are being donated to healthcare facilities by construction companies, by other industrial manufacturers and other employers. And so then this leaves those workers, because they likely needed to use those masks, it leaves construction workers and other industrial workers with less options for their protection. So usually we know as safety professionals that PPE, like respirators, is always looked at as the last resort on our hierarchy of controls. But of course there's several regulations like Table 1 of the Construction Silica Standard that PPE like respirators might be specified for tasks that a worker usually does. So they're not using engineering controls sometimes. They're not using a combination of engineering and administrative controls. So they're using that PPE. And so now's the time to potentially invest in other PPE, even though it is going to be increasingly difficult to source half and full face respirators as well, as healthcare providers will likely be turning to those. So consider PPE truly that last resort and work through the hierarchy of controls so that you can find other ways right now in the interim or for now and going forward that you can use to protect the workers while the respiratory protection resources are being diverted to healthcare facilities and to those healthcare providers who are truly working on the front lines and have that most potential to be exposed to COVID-19 and to become ill. And as we've seen in some cases, healthcare providers have passed away. And so it is important that if you have non-healthcare operations that usually use an N95 mask, you've got to find a different way to protect the workers right now by working through the hierarchy of controls. If the task is not essential at this time, just put it on hold until this situation is more under control and the gear becomes more widely available again. So what else? Pretty much all the news right now related to worker safety and health is related to coronavirus. So that's pretty much what I have. There have been fatalities and incidents that have occurred related to non-coronavirus incidents, of course. There's been trench cave-ins, there's been fatal falls, especially in construction. So we definitely do still have our usual hazards to contend with on our work sites. For those of us that are in industries that are considered critical infrastructure, just know that this does not mean all hands on deck. It doesn't mean everybody comes to the job site at the normal working hours or everyone reports to the office like usual. You want to make sure that you're obeying and following the rules of any of your local, like your city or county or state's shelter-in-place orders. And most of us are under some kind of shelter-in-place order at this time. And so again, even though your industry may be considered critical infrastructure, please do still identify the people that are actually critical to your on-site operations. This is office operations, this is manufacturing, this is construction, anything. Identify who actually needs to be at these sites. Also, take into consideration that schools and childcare facilities are still closed in many areas, and working parents are taking on a lot more responsibility for childcare than usual. And so, even though people may not be sick and they're still in critical infrastructure, they still may have challenges that they have to face at home. Also, make sure to use those administrative and work practice controls to minimize the amount of people and employees that you have at a site or at a specific operation or in an office or other specific areas at a given time. Think about adding more shifts, different flexible hours, and other options for those who are maybe immunocompromised and can't be around potentially infected people, or also, again, for those working parents who are juggling a lot right now. Also, make sure that workers have the training they need to do their jobs safely while also keeping hygiene in mind. This is something that's good advice all the time, but right now workers may be tasked with new responsibilities based on what is considered critical to your operations. So you may be taking people from what they usually do as their regular task and having them support what your critical operations are as part of your critical infrastructure. So many facilities might be changing their production right now to something that supports current needs, like distilleries are making hand sanitizer now, and some industries are shifting from producing a specific product to now they're making medical devices or PPE or face shields. So just because we're all in emergency response mode, it doesn't mean that the usual best practices for worker communication and training your workers go out the window. You can still use things like JSAs, job safety analysis, pre-task planning, toolbox talks, tailgate meetings. All those other connections and touch points with the workers are more important than they've ever been. However, you might have to do those things in a slightly different way to make sure you're maintaining at least that 6 feet of physical distance, but you still have to communicate with people. So use other pathways like posting something on a bulletin board or printing individual handouts and everyone grabs one. Sending text messages or emails or posting videos for people to receive safety messages. You should also be taking this time to review your emergency and disaster planning. And we are truly living in interesting times where we can conduct a debrief almost every single day, that there's something that happened, something that you did in response, and something that you can learn from. There's news like this weekend's FDA EUAs breaking frequently, as well as shelter in place and other orders that are changing to meet the demands to flatten the curve of COVID-19 and its impact. Last thing, this got a lot longer than these usually are, but the last thing that I want to point out is that you should take care of yourself. So if your schedule is changing, you've got kids at home, you've got your spouse at home, you're all working at home, or whatever else is going on because of how things have changed. Your responsibilities might be changing at work or expanding. Make sure that you're eating well, that you're hydrating, drink water, and make sure you get some rest. So you need to be able to take on the workday with a fresh mind, wherever or whenever that is, especially if you're working a different shift than usual. Things have changed. It's even a little disorienting being on the roads. I took my family out for a little drive around town, and it feels weird because nobody's on the roads. And so there's all this difference, all the stuff going on in the world. It can really change how people are processing even the most mundane things like driving around, something that we do all the time. So make sure to take care of yourself, encourage those that you work with to do the same, and we're going to get through this. There's a lot of innovation that I think is going to happen out of all of this, and I think we're all going to be better for it. So make sure that you're well rested and that you're able to take on each day, and give yourself that space as well. So thanks again for listening. There will be a special podcast of the Safety Justice League this week with some mental health tips for these interesting times that I've alluded to and that we're all living in. So I hope you take a look at the Safety Justice League podcast. The interview, it's one that I conducted with Frank King, who is called the Mental Health Comedian. And so there's lots of really interesting information that he presented for us to take care of our mental health during these times. So I encourage you to check that out. Thanks again for listening, and check in next week for more safety news.